Hello, everybody. It's September the... Oops, start again. Hello, everybody. It is September the 19th, 2024. 18 months is a long time, particularly in the Middle East. 18 months ago, I did a show with Michael Scott-Baumann on the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israel-Palestine issue. He is the author of a book, a very unbiased, or about as unbiased, I think, as you can get. The shortest history of Israel and Palestine, from Zionism to intifadas and the struggle for peace. As I said, we ran it on April the 3rd of last year, 2023. We titled it The Problem to End All Problems, Michael Scott-Baumann on the tragically parallel history of Israel and Palestine. Michael Baumann, I'm pleased, is back with us today, 18 months later. Mike, it's been quite an 18 months. In an odd way, I was thinking about this before we went live. Has what's happened really since October of last year, has that made the history of Israel and Palestine in a weird way shorter?
No, I'm afraid not. No, it's very hard to see an end to the conflict. I mean, I think there are ways forward, but no, I think it's intensified it. And I think the two sides are further apart than ever. Well, I say two sides, it's not as simple as that. The PA is sidelined by majority Palestinian opinion, as well as very much by the Israelis. And Hamas is seen by Israel and its American ally as beyond the pale. So, no, I don't think it has shortened.
So let me rephrase the question, Mike. And maybe I didn't express myself very clearly here. You're, as I said, you're about as unbiased as you can get. The book on Amazon has almost 200 reviews. You've got 4-star reviews, as you suggested to me before we went live. If you do have any critics, it's from Israel, but most Israelis, I think, and Jews acknowledge that you're doing your best to be fair. But for most people, this history of Israel and Palestine is so simple. You don't need me to tell you this. It's so black and white. It's so bound up in one side being good and one being evil, that what's happened since October has only compounded that. That's what I meant. Is it nothing much? I mean, obviously, everyone talks about this enormously tragic, this catastrophic event in October that resulted in the Israeli invasion of Gaza. Today, Israel's been sending bombs all over Lebanon. We're on the brink, it would seem, of another Middle Eastern war, maybe even bringing in Iran. But my question is, has anything really changed? Has it only compounded the divisions, the narratives, the sense of injustice and anger and violence?
I think you're right. I think it has impounded all those factors. Yes. I mean, the occupation is more entrenched than ever. Israel seems even less willing to think that a Palestinian state is possible. I mean, that's quite out of the question at the moment. Most of the world, quite rightly, sees Hamas as responsible for the most appalling atrocities on October the 7th. It didn't arise out of a vacuum, but it was an atrocity nevertheless, a crime against humanity by any definition.
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively high-tech version of a pogrom, a 21st century version of a pogrom.
If you like, yes.
I mean, that's one way of putting it, for better or worse.
Well, yes, I don't think Hamas is out to obliterate the Jews. I mean, I think the word pogrom is very ill-advised and inappropriate.
Oh, so it's I shouldn't be using that word, you think?
Not of what Hamas did, no.
Well, I want to. I mean, a pogrom was a word associated with the Russians, rather the Tsarist regime, rather than the Nazis. I mean,
yeah,
Russian pogroms weren't the final solution; they were just simply anti-Jewish riots.
Yeah,
Anyway, I mean, we don't need to go. I mean, we get stuck in all these, we get lost in all these rabbit holes, Mike.
Hmm.
Let's go back
Yes, I
to
mean,
October.
you could
Sorry,
say
go on.
Israel has been conducting a pogrom over the last 57 years, denying Palestinian rights on the West Bank and in Gaza. I mean, I prefer not to use words like that. As you say, we can go down a rabbit hole. Similarly, the word terror is bandied about so loosely.
Yeah, so pogrom and terror, we need to get rid of these words. I mean, I don't disagree. So let's go back to October. Were you surprised? I mean, you know this stuff as well as anyone. It's your thing. You've written books about it. You work now for the Balfour Project. We'll get to that later. When you woke up on that morning and you saw what was happening, were you shocked, or did you think, well, I knew something like this was going to happen?
I was shocked, yes. I mean, I could understand that it didn't come out of a vacuum, but I was still shocked. And I think the vast majority of people were.
Well,
Yes.
I mean, my response and my reaction, and I don't know this stuff like you do, but I follow it, was obviously surprise, shock. But my shock was about the stupidity of the action. Did it make the Hamas action, this kind of invasion of Israel, quasi-invasion, did it make any military or political sense to you?
Hamas was well, okay. I think it wanted to derail any likelihood of another one of these Abraham Accords, this time between Israel and the Saudis, the most significant Arab nation, if you like. But
Donald Trump's supposed achievement.
Yeah, I was surprised by the success that Hamas had and how ill prepared the Israelis were. If the Hamas had just attacked the Israeli military, I don't think it would have been quite such the atrocity as it was, but the quite gratuitous killing of men, women, and children and the youngsters at an outdoor festival was truly shocking. Mind, I find it shocking, really, that an outdoor music festival would be held right on the border.
Why?
Well, because it's so tense on that border. I guess it was indicative of the Israeli authorities feeling that they had the border sealed so well that it couldn't be penetrated, and yes, the organizer of the festival similarly believing that Israel was unbeatable. And the Palestinians were out of sight over the other side.
Right. And I'm not sure if you've seen the movie or read Martin Amos's book, The Zone of Interest. There's a new movie out. There's a quality to that border, which is like the zone of interest, where no one wanted to know what was happening on the other side.
Right.
There are all sorts of conspiracy theories here. I know you've written an extension to The Shortest History, which is going to be out later this year. So maybe we can talk about that in a minute. But all sorts of conspiracy theories. I've read lots suggesting that from Netanyahu's point of view, this wasn't necessarily a bad event. Was this, or is this a catastrophe for Netanyahu?
No, I mean, I'm very wary of conspiracy theories, but certainly while the war goes on, he's less likely to be displaced, and therefore he's less likely to lose power and to be put on trial for corruption. I'm not saying, therefore, he would have supported this attack and the opportunity it gave.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not part of those conspiracies. I'm not suggesting he was, but it seems to have, the narrative seems to have worked out well in some ways for him. Is that fair?
Yes. Excuse me. I got someone doing work next door. Just let me shut the door.
It's Netanyahu.
I had asked the builder to stop at 4 o'clock, but anyway.
Go on. So, so back to Mr. Netanyahu.
As long as the war continues, I don't see any likelihood of Netanyahu falling from power. We're being told of the divisions within his administration, that he's at odds with the defense minister Gallant, and that because he's so dependent on the support of people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich that, he's not likely to bend. not likely to make peace except on what he sees as hugely advantageous terms.
Mike, this week the Israelis pulled off a remarkable, it seems, at least in technological terms, a coup in Lebanon, sending bombs in communications devices. The Hamas invasion of Gaza was much more low tech, but did it reflect a cleverness on their part? Were you surprised by their ability to pull this thing off? As you say, they got a bit lucky, perhaps, but it was in its own way quite an achievement, wasn't it?
It was a very significant achievement, and in the weeks following, we were led to believe that it had been long in the planning, and I suppose most of us should have guessed they might have been planning something like this, long in the planning and kept very secret. And when you consider Israel's huge technological superiority and ability to track its opponents, it is astounding that Israel got no wind of this.
Is this a bug, though? Do you think it was, in Silicon Valley, we use this term, was it a bug or a feature of the Israeli defense system? Did they just overlook this one? I mean, in the months since, they've achieved all these high-tech assassinations. What's happening this week in Lebanon is astonishing, shocking for many, but astonishing for others. Does this reflect a problem with the Israeli defense forces, or was it just one mistake?
Well, there'll certainly have to be an examination when the fighting dies down. I'm sure there will be a talk for an analysis of how the Israelis were caught off guard and why the military response was delayed. I forget by how much it was delayed, but I think it's widely agreed that it was delayed. I'm sure there will have to be an analysis of what went wrong. But meanwhile, as you say, we repeatedly hear of Israel's astounding technological achievements,
which are considerable, for better or worse. I mean, for some people, this is
no wonder
it's a terrible crime, and probably it's a combination of both.
It's no wonder that many Arab states are keen to get their hands on Israeli armaments and surveillance equipment, which I'm sure has been one of the motives for those Arab countries that have signed accords with Israel. It does give them access to the most advanced.
Right. So going back to your point about the Abraham Accords, which Donald Trump claims as his achievement, which, of course, I guess in a sense it was. Why is Hamas against the Abraham Accords?
Because these accords, they always push Palestinians to the side. I mean, the states with which they've made agreements may have said, look, we want to see some movement on peacemaking, but I think the Israelis have stood out against it and done so very successfully. Whether they would be able to do so with Saudis or not, I don't know. But Saudi, as we know, is a highly authoritarian regime. And I'm not sure how much the Arabs on the street influence they can have on the Saudi government.
You use this phrase, the Arabs on the street, Mike. It's been a phrase that's been used for a century now. Is it even relevant today? I mean, where are the Arabs on the street? In Iraq? In Jordan?
Yeah, okay. Public opinion is highly, very much controlled in countries like Saudi Arabia. Yes.
And then let's bring in this is such an international crisis. There are people who argue that this was essentially an Iranian operation. What are the relations between Hamas and Iran, and how much did Iran know about this invasion?
I'm not an expert on Hamas-Iranian relations, to be honest. Iran is supportive of Hamas, but I'm not aware of it providing vast amounts of arms like it does to Hezbollah. It's certainly not an Iranian proxy, although Israel and to a certain extent the United States might like to portray it as such. Widening the war does help Netanyahu maintain US support, because any threat from Iran and the US will back the Israelis to the hilt. And we know there are 2 American aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean. So maybe Israelis' actions in the north deflected some of the world's attention from what's happening in Gaza.
And what about Hezbollah? They're in the news this week because of this this Israeli attack. How would you place Hezbollah in terms of your shortest history of Israel and Palestine? Are they an external force? Are they essentially a Palestinian group to the north?
No, they're Shia Muslim, not a Palestinian group.
There are many Palestinians who are part of Hezbollah. Is that fair?
Well, it's largely a Shia Muslim grouping, and it was created by Israel. It was a response to Israel's invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon in the early 1980s. That's where and when it arose.
And is it also fair to say, Mike, that Hamas was the creation of Israel and that it was created in order to undermine Arafat, Palestinian Authority?
To a certain extent, it's been, yes. I mean, I think there is evidence that Netanyahu wanted to see Hamas strengthened vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. That it suited the Israelis for the Palestinians to be divided.
Yeah, we've got this, as we called it last time you were on the show, the parallel histories of Israel and Palestine, tragically parallel. Are there parallels then between Sinwar and Netanyahu? They seem to, in some ways, share similar goals. This perpetual state of war, of terror, of terrorism, I know you don't like those words, or violence, seem to suit both of them.
Maybe. I mean, I personally believe that Hamas has let it be known that it would recognize a state of Israel once the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza was ended. It may not have changed the terms of its charter, but I mean, there has been contact between members of Netanyahu's government, kept very secret, members of Hamas in previous years. And Hamas has let it be known it would recognize a Palestinian state alongside Israel. But yes, but it's not going to do so until the occupation has ended. Hamas has seen what happened in Oslo, that the Palestinians made peace, they renounced the use of violence, they recognized the state of Israel, and the Palestinians, perhaps naively, were led to believe that this was the first step towards the creation of a Palestinian state. But there was no recognition in the Oslo Accords of Palestine's right to a state of its own. So I think Palestinians supporters of Hamas and Hamas leadership looked at what had happened to the Palestinian Authority. They'd made peace and it got them nowhere. In fact, the occupation in the West Bank became even more entrenched after Oslo. So I think Hamas would say only when the occupation has ended could we even consider recognizing the state of Israel.
And meanwhile, the headlines this week on Netanyahu is that his map of Israel, and this is according to Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, shows the map of Israel from being, quote unquote, from the river to the sea. Has this given an opportunity for Netanyahu, and you mentioned Smotrich, some of these other extreme right-wingers within his government, to essentially end any talk of a two-state solution?
I think any talk of a two-state solution doesn't exist in Israel anymore. And I think what's happened since October the 7th makes Netanyahu and his right-wing allies, and many in Israel, keener than ever to entrench Israeli control of the whole area from the river to the sea. Yes, indeed.
So let's go back to October 7th, Mike. As I said, you're about as unbiased as you can get on this stuff. What would have been, in your view, the correct Israeli response to this violent incursion?
Well, I wasn't at all surprised at Israel's response. And I think Netanyahu, given the atrocity, is probably glad of the opportunity to crush.
Yeah, but that's not my question. We know that, and we know the response. The tens of thousands of people, many of them innocent, killed with the Israeli invasion of Gaza, which is just more of the same. What could, if there was an Israeli government that was bent on peace, what could they have done after October 7th?
Well, I mean, maybe October the 7th wouldn't have happened, or maybe it wouldn't.
No, but you're
happened.
not answering. But we know it happened. I mean, that's not the answer.
Well, what could Israel have done? Well, Israel, let's. I mean, I'm not too keen on counterfactual history. Israel had a very right-wing government, dominated to a certain extent, very dependent on the ministers representing the religious nationalists. I can't see a government like that responding.
Yeah, but you're not answering. But I understand that. But let's say there hadn't been such a right-wing government. Could it have been conceivable, had Israel had a more centrist government, that they would have held up their hands after October 7th and said, when there was considerable global sympathy for what happened, and said, this is a terrible crime, and now is the opportunity to address some way of ending this problem? Is that conceivable?
It would have been seen as weakness, and I'm not aware of any Israeli government in recent decades that's been willing to let itself be seen as weak. So no, I can't see any Israeli government doing anything but hitting back hard. Now, not necessarily a war that lasts 10 months or led to the virtual destruction of so much of the country, so much of the Strip, including churches, mosques, schools, universities. Whatever the evidence of Hamas using these places as hideouts, I mean, it has been very considerable, the destruction. And there are Israeli commentators who will say this would appear to be an attack on Israeli society, on Palestinian society.
Yeah, we've had many of them, well, some of them writers, progressive intellectuals of one kind or another on the show. It's all very depressing. I mean, one of the headlines today in the Jerusalem Post, and I'm quoting the headline: "Single stage deal could see all hostages released, offer Sinwar safe passage out of Gaza." I mean, if that happened, wouldn't that be the most absurd conclusion? That Sinwar would somehow escape, the hostages would be released, nothing would have been achieved.
Yes, I mean, I can only see that happening if Netanyahu felt he was under extreme pressure.
Could he get away with? Yeah, I mean, freeing Sinwar would be.
Yes, that would be seen.
Even for a political Houdini like Netanyahu would require immense skills.
He would. But on the other hand, if he did allow that to happen, America would be even less likely to oppose his establishment of a very strong control over the southern border, the so-called Philadelphia corridor. Netanyahu's government seems intent on having complete control of that border. And if they got that, they may well feel that giving safe passage to Sinwar was worth it. I think Israel is keen to completely seal Gaza. Whether that'll ever achieve that or not, I don't know. I mean, the longer that war goes on, most Gazans will become desperate, lose all hope, but also there'll be a number of Gazans who become radicalized.
That goes without saying. I mean, any Gazan who isn't radicalized, it's hard to imagine. How is Sinwar seen? I mean, he has eluded the Israelis. It's quite a military achievement. How is he seen both in Gaza and on the West Bank, and more broadly within the Arab world?
I can't say, to be honest. I don't know. I mean, okay, he'll be seen as the leader of the resistance, and the resistance which is justified, not necessarily by the atrocities of October the 7th, but armed resistance to Israel's illegal occupation will be seen by many in the Arab world as justified, defensible. And he's the leader of that. I mean, the fact that the Israelis had, what's his name, Haniyeh, assassinated, he played such a prominent part in the peace negotiations, or in the negotiations over a deal, that did seem to suggest that Israel wasn't interested in the deal. He was seen as a pragmatist, and he was central to those negotiations in Qatar. I'm not aware of, I'm sure Sinwar has representatives in Qatar, but I don't think negotiations are going anywhere at the moment.
Are there alternative Palestinians? I mean, it seems as if what Hamas achieved only underlines the gerontocratic nature of the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank. One sometimes hears about other Palestinian leaders who might be more palatable both to Israel and the West. Are there any?
Well,
who are also not sort of Biden-esque in their irrelevance.
I know. Well, America and Western European countries talk about what kind of Palestinian government we need and we want and is desirable. Ultimately, it has to be the Palestinians that decide how they want to be governed and by whom. And as some say, just as there'll have to be a new election in Israel at some stage in the future, there also needs to be free and fair Palestinian elections. There were free and fair Palestinian elections in 2006, but they elected the wrong party. Hamas got the majority. And Israel said, we'll have nothing to do with this. Any government has members of Hamas in it. Israel stopped the import duties they collect on behalf of the Palestinian Authority from reaching Ramallah. And the West then fell in behind Israel and stopped all support for the Palestinian Authority while there was any possibility of Hamas members being included. I believe that at some stage in the future, the Palestinians have to be consulted about how they want to be governed. And that has to be done in such a way that Israel can't and the West can't veto the results. And again, that's what Gideon Levy of Haaretz newspaper will say. We have to have the Palestinians speak for themselves. So I think all this talk in the West of what kind of government, Palestinian government would be we favor it's not for us to decide.
But
you're right, it is Jeron Tucker. Yes, it's an old man, and he's lost credibility with the vast majority of the Palestinian populace on the West Bank. Yeah.
Does Hamas, I always just took it for granted that Hamas was, like most quote unquote, I know you don't like this term, terrorist organizations, whether it's the PLO or the IRA, it's always divided between civilians and military. And it was always, on the one hand, you throw bombs, on the other hand, you get to the negotiating table. And in the end, as with the IRA, although that's perhaps a little bit more complicated, you achieve some sort of peace. Does Hamas fit into that model of being made up of both political and military figures, a resistance group?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has its military wings. And I think Mohammed Deif was seen as the leader of the military wing. He was one of the three Palestinian Hamas leaders that Israel was very keen to kill, and I think they succeeded. I think around the same time as they killed Haniyeh, well, we assume they killed Haniyeh in Tehran. I'm sure that there is a military leadership that focuses on the military response, as well as a leadership that perhaps focuses more on any negotiations. Indeed.
So what you noted earlier, that to get anywhere here, we in the West, who are important in the sense that we supply the arms, particularly to Israel, need to understand what the Palestinian people want. you've written this book, The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine. You spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this. What do they want? There's a lot of talk, particularly in the pro-Israel lobby in the US, about the brutality of the Hamas regime, particularly in the context of their persecution of homosexuals and anyone who disagrees with them. If we really knew what the Palestinians want, both in Gaza and on the West Bank, what would it be?
Well, I mean, first of all, it suits the pro-Israel lobby, and it suits the American right to emphasize the brutality of the Hamas regime. And I'm sure many have been executed over the years for collaboration or suspected collaboration. But I think many Gazans still see Hamas as leading the resistance. And it's the occupation which is the main reason for Palestinian resistance. And Gaza has been occupied for the previous 20 years. Although the Israeli military had withdrawn in 2006 and Israeli settlers were withdrawn, Gaza remained under a very tight blockade. And the Israelis controlled just how much food, just how much medicine, just how much electricity was allowed into Gaza. It has been the largest outdoor prison in the world for 17, 18 years. Palestinians, above all, want an end to the occupation.
How did Hamas govern Gaza differently from the way in which the Palestinian Authority, which is notoriously corrupt, have governed the West Bank? Are there differences? Is Hamas more muscular in its ability to actually achieve things? You've described it as the largest outdoor prison in the world, which I don't think is that controversial. Most people would agree outside the Netanyahu circles. But did they manage to govern this outdoor prison effectively outside the violence?
They ran the health services, the education. Presumably they had to cooperate or liaise with UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Administration, because they ran the education and basic health services in the refugee camps within Gaza. But I think Hamas got majority support in the elections of 2006 because it had provided very good social welfare services. It provided education, it provided healthcare, and it was seen as clean. You're quite right. From the moment the Palestinian leadership came back from Tunis and established itself in Ramallah and took over leading roles in the Palestinian Authority, there have been accusations of corruption, indeed, and nepotism amongst the leadership. Whereas I think Hamas was seen as clean. Also, they were seen as not having given in to the Israelis in a peace deal, Oslo, that patently wasn't to the Palestinians' advantage. Now, how much support Hamas has continued to enlist up to 2023, I don't know. I'm sure its government was highly authoritarian. But I think there was huge support for Hamas as leaders of the resistance.
What do you make of the explosion of the propaganda war since October 7th? In Haaretz this morning, there's the Jewish Chronicle scandal, the Jewish paper in England, I'm sure you're familiar with, where becoming pro-Israel means becoming a megaphone for the Netanyahu government. So this is, again, an argument from Haaretz. And on the other hand, of course, you have more and more, I know for sure it's propaganda, but more and more outside concern for what are seen as Israeli war crimes in Gaza. One headline today is about an artist who used 15,000 teddy bears in memorial to Gaza's children. Is this explosion of disagreement and protest and violence in the West on campuses in the United States, is it different, or is it just really, Mike, more of the same?
Well, it has taken a different form since October the 7th. I mean, we hear a lot in the press in Britain, probably more in America, about Israeli hostages. We see photos of them, we see biographies of them, we see their family interviewed. There's much less about that, about the Palestinians, partly because the Western reporters can't get into Gaza. We do hear much more about Israeli victims, certainly the Israeli hostages, than we do about the Palestinians being killed. I mean, I'm kept in contact with what's happening in the West Bank through Israeli as well as Palestinian news sources that tell me much more about individual Palestinian youth, particularly, who've been killed. But most of the Western press, there's much more sympathy for, I think, the Israelis. And I know that Gideon Levy of Haaretz is amazed at how cowed the media in the West seem to be. I think he and other writers on Haaretz are probably more critical of the Israeli government than the vast majority of Western media outlets.
Do you think that in 50 or 100 years, when hopefully there'll be some solution to this, historians will look back and see it as, in the same way as we look back at the 19th century colonial history of Africa, and we will see this as a kind of collective shame for this convenient avoidance of what has happened, particularly in Gaza over the last year?
Yes, I do. I mean, in 50 years' time, there will still be Palestinians in the area from the river to the sea, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank cities. I mean, Area C, the largely rural area of the West Bank, may well be cleansed, but there will still be several million Gazans living in this land. At some stage in the future, as Yitzhak Rabin said, these two peoples live side by side. They are neighbors. At some stage, they've got to learn to live together, because the Palestinians aren't going to go away. The Israelis may be able to cleanse much of the West Bank, but there will still be, a couple of million Palestinians living in the cities of the West Bank, just as there'll still be hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in Gaza, though under what conditions, I don't know. It's going to be decades before Gaza can be rebuilt. Yeah, I don't know. Will we recognize that this was a settler colonial project in the same way that there were Europeans established?
Well, that wasn't what I said, but
no, I know you didn't.
That's another, and everyone has their own convenience avoidance of the subject. So whether or not it's exactly settler colonialism, to me, is not really the issue. There's some of it, and some of it's different. It's just the terrible crime against humanity that's being perpetrated.
Yeah.
I mean, when we look back, and when historians look back, how much of the responsibility will be laid on what seems to me to be the incredibly pathetic response of the US government? I mean, Biden, in my view at least, seems to be absent without leave as president. He doesn't address the issue, and Harris talks about human suffering in Gaza without offering any kind of solution on any front. How much ultimately, Mike, is this the responsibility of a US government that is utterly clueless about how to deal with this problem and incapable of controlling its supposedly junior ally?
And I think we will look back and see that America bears a huge responsibility. I mean, over the last 50 years, the Americans, often followed by the British and other European countries, have been blocking UN resolutions calling for an end to the occupation. I'm sure they will vote against the UN General, well, they have done, UN General Assembly resolution on the advisory opinion. We will look back and see that America was the one country that could have brought Israel to heel, if you like. I mean, it was interesting, 1992, I think it was, when the Americans were very keen for the Israelis to have face-to-face meetings with leaders of the PLO. It was only when Bush, the elder Bush, I think, threatened to withhold some credits And the Israelis agreed, we will talk face to face. I mean, America has such huge leverage economically, politically, militarily. And the global South does see the West as duplicitous.
Well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, this is not just some sort of paranoia. I mean, there's such self-evident double standards on this thing. I mean, had I don't know, Russia sent devices and blown up thousands of people in Ukraine yesterday, the whole world would be totally, the whole of America in particular would be totally outraged. But given that it was Israel doing this in Lebanon, they got away with it.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. No, I'm sure history will see America bears a huge responsibility, and it's, Western European countries.
Well, talking of responsibility, I know you're very much involved with the Balfour Project in terms of taking responsibility. What can we do? You're involved on the front lines here. You're a writer. You're clearly about as unbiased as you can get, although I'm guessing there'll be pro-Israel people in the audience who will claim you're not, but I think you are. What does the Balfour Project do? And what are you trying to do alongside writing these books and trying to...
Well, first of all, let me explain the setting up of the Balfour Project. It was established before I joined in 2 or 3 years before the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. And it was so called because prime aim then was to educate the British about Britain's responsibility, historic responsibility for what had happened in Palestine. And that's why I think the name was adopted. Our strapline says we want peace, justice based on equal rights. So yes, we do advocate for equal rights for Palestinians and Israelis. And
which isn't exactly radical.
No, it's not exactly radical, but it's a start. First of all, to persuade the British government to recognize Palestine isn't going to make any immediate difference on the ground, but could be the beginning. We've got to keep up our pressure. We hold webinars. We certainly liaise with a limit weekly. I mean, 2 or 3 of our senior people, one an ex-diplomat, someone that worked for the UN for many years, do hold regular meetings with sympathetic members of parliament from all the main parties, so they can put forward questions in parliament, so they can keep up support for attempts to change the British government policy. That's the kind of thing we do. I mean, I very much focus on teaching about the history, and I've spoken at schools and colleges, at universities. Most of the questions...
history, though, no, I don't mean to denigrate this, because the nature of this show has always been that history matters more than anything else. But does this history ultimately matter because it's so politicized and there are so many deeply entrenched readings? What's the value of understanding this history?
To understand how we've got to be where we are today. And in the case of Israel-Palestine, it's understanding the innumerable mistakes that have been made by Israelis, by Palestinians as well, and by Western powers. We need to understand. I know it does appear like the endless story of doing the wrong thing, but I think we have to try and understand it in order to move forward. I mean, for instance, if people say, what happened on October the 7th arose out of a vacuum, we have to put them right in order to understand it. We do have to understand what's happened over the last 20, 30, 50, 70 years.
Are you earlier in this conversation, you basically dismissed the Oslo Accords as being not benefiting the Palestinians in any way. There is, of course, the position that the Palestinians have always walked away from every deal they've been offered, and every time they walk away, they get a worse deal. Are there any deals, in your view, that the Palestinians shouldn't have walked away from?
Well, I mean, Oslo, the Palestinians did fully agree to it. They threw their weight behind it. And the bullion Arafat was confident that further negotiations would lead to the creation of a Palestinian state. There's an example where the Palestinians signed an accord, entered into negotiations, but got stuffed, quite frankly, because it was an accord signed between two hugely unequal partners. And then it was followed up by the second Oslo Accord of 1995, which gave Israel the right to militarily dominate the most of the West Bank. It gave Israel the right to set up settler-only roads, which crisscrossed Palestinian territory, divided up the Palestinian territory. These are the things we have to learn about, but that's an example of where the Palestinians did make peace, I think, in good faith. For various reasons, it unraveled. It is partly assassination of Rabin. It's partly suicide bombings by Hamas, but it's also terror tactics by a number of Israelis, including the settler who walked into a mosque and killed 29 people at prayer, which in turn very much triggered a second wave of Hamas bombings. Yeah, our organization, it might be seen as just a talking shop, but we have to continue to try and educate people. We have to continue to pressurize Parliament, above all, to recognize and implement international law. And
then does Israel or this whole thing become a sort of equivalent of Cyprus or the Southern Sudan, a basket case for the UN? Equal rights for Palestinians and Israelis, is that a euphemism for the end of a two-state solution?
No. Equal rights could end up with a two-state
solution. Isn't a two-state solution, isn't that inconceivable, about as impossible politically as one could get today?
I agree, but similarly, a one-state solution in which all Palestinians and Israelis have equal rights, that's equally inconceivable at the present. I agree.
So what is conceivable? So if we can't have a two-state solution, and in your view, you can't have a one-state solution where Arabs and Israelis get, the Palestinians and Israelis get the same rights, what's the solution?
Well, it's going to take years and years and years. We have.
You're basically saying there is no solution.
I'm saying
why is it going to take years and years and years when nothing changes and things only get worse?
We have to start with the reconstruction of Gaza, and that has to be, I would say, under the UN. The UN's best equipped to do that. Somehow Israel has to be persuaded to allow the UN to oversee the rebuilding of Gaza. I agree. It's hard to see a way forward in the present circumstances.
Yeah, and you rebuild Gaza, it just becomes like Bosnia, or Kosovo, where you just have this perpetual decay and corruption and anger, maybe not formal violence.
Yeah, it's going to be. So
it's miserable, Mike. I mean, if you had. Miserable.
But I believe our hope has to rest. We still have the foundations of international law. Now, at the moment, Israel disregards it, and America seems to allow Israel to disregard it. And America, vetoes the latest UN General Assembly resolution. Yeah, it's hard to see a way forward, but I believe it has to be based on international law. And the United Nations said in 1948 there should be a Jewish state and there should be a Palestinian state. There is a Jewish state, but we haven't got yet a Palestinian state. I'm not saying the Palestinians haven't made mistakes. I mean, the worst mistake Arafat ever made, I think, was to applaud the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991. He did this because Iraq had been a staunch supporter of the PLO, but it earned him the animosity of most of the Arab states, and particularly of Kuwait. And Kuwait at that time was home to about 200,000 Palestinians who were living and working there and sending remittances back to Palestine. I mean, that was a terrible mistake. It left him diplomatically isolated. Yes, mistakes have been made, and we need to learn from them.
Yeah, I don't think you even convince yourself, let alone everybody else, Mike. I mean, it's not your fault. It's just a miserable situation.
It is.
Is there any, let's end, because we could go on, and we'll get you back on the show when the new edition of The Shortest History comes out with its inclusion of your analysis of what's happened in Gaza. But is there anything we could be cheerful about on on September the 19th, 2024? Any reed of hope that we can grasp?
Yes. The only hope, I believe, has to be rest with the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, the World Court. That we have to hope that we can still maintain a rules-based international order. It's very hard to see it being maintained, but that has to be our aim.
Well, Michael, Scott-Baumann or Baumann, I know. How do I pronounce it, Mike?
Bowman.
Bowman. I don't want to make you sound too Jewish or too Arab. You're a guy stuck in between. You've done a great job. You're very fair. It's a depressing subject, and we need guys like you. We'll get you back on the show in the not too distant future when the new edition of the book comes out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.